Chapter 23. Pilgrim had arrived at Signor Bianchi's villa uncharacteristically late. Brian had flown her over and was now heading back to the UK. They'd arrived on time, however she'd taken extra bathroom breaks where she'd rested a perspiration-clad forehead against the sink mirror whilst she'd clutched the sides of the sink. Her car had been kept waiting on the tarmac for 15 minutes after they'd landed. Brian had been very concerned, telling her to stay on board and he'd take her back post-haste. She'd given him one penetrating look before he'd reluctantly stepped away from the top of the boarding stairs. Although she still felt unwell, she was determined to ignore it. Besides, Hansford would be there. Upon arrival at Bianchi's villa, she was shown to her room and asked if she'd meet the other guests as soon as possible. There was a prophetic toll ringing intermittently in her head, like a buoy out at sea. "What the hell am I doing here, in my state?" she thought. Sitting on the side of her bed, she pulled on a pair of high heels, deciding to go in search of Hansford. There was an uneasy truce between them. Since Merrimar, she'd had time to reconsider. As far as she was concerned, she wanted a relationship to remain as it had. She'd visit him or he'd visit her, no complications or explanations. Hansford had changed the rules. He'd wanted more. She'd been blunt. It was never going to happen. If she had to lose him and move on, she would. In the interim, she was going to maintain the status quo, especially given her current ill health. The last thing she needed was a combative situation. She decided to be charm itself. She found him lying on a chair on the patio, with his back to her. Immediately she smelt the familiar and intoxicating scent of him, and it threatened to weaken her already fragile state. "Pull up a chair, Neath," he rumbled. The soft familiar timbre of his voice dissolved her anxiety. All she wanted to do was lay her head on his chest and let him look after her, which she knew he would. She held herself in check. "What's new, Hansford?" she asked lightly. As she came into his line of sight, his eyes slowly travelled from her shoes to her face. What he saw there concerned him. "What's wrong? You're abnormally pale," he stated anxiously, immediately raising his hand out to touch her. He'd discovered Draper had requested her presence, and he couldn't deny he'd welcomed the idea of seeing her. She took a step back. "I'm fine, just a little tired." They both knew it was a lie, but he accepted she didn't want to talk about it. He decided to change the subject. "Well, the villa's drawn a blank. No one can shed any light on what happened to Donata. I'm sure Bianchi's not telling me everything. Keeping in mind I can be a jaded bastard at sometimes." "Only sometimes?" she teased, taking a seat opposite him. "So, just here for the Bianchi girl." "Why else? Do you want to pool resources and—" He began to chuckle. "Pool resources? No." Noticing a thin line of perspiration on her forehead, he became serious. "Neath, you're not well." He reached for her hands, grasping them together. The effect was immediate. A spark of mutual need ignited between them. "Your hands are like ice," he added, concerned. She snatched them away. She was only going to be there for one night. She could manage one night, surely. "I'm fine. I told you, I'm just tired." He stood and began to walk back inside. If she didn't want to tell him what was really going on, then so be it. It seemed like this was going to be all business. She didn't need him anyway. What did he know that might enlighten her? And where the hell was Baxter? Why had he let her come when she was so unwell? Baxter should never have allowed her to come in that state. She stood, heading after him. She found him in one of the grand reception rooms, accepting a tumbler of whiskey from an obliging waiter. "I'll have a gin martini," she instructed the waiter. She was here to do a job, to observe only and report her findings. She'd accepted Draper's invitation, purely because she couldn't help thinking the death of Donata Bianchi was somehow linked with the liquid door, which meant the Titans were involved. What she'd miscalculated was her ability to focus on the task at hand with Hansford around when she was so fragile. She watched him, thinking how best to extract what he'd learned from being here. She concluded a direct approach might work. "An innocent girl is dead. Someone put their hands on her, Hansford." He took a large swig and looked at her. Even though she looked shattered, the light in her eyes was mesmerizing. If anything, her pale face served to emphasize their brightness. "I know as much as you do." "You'll forgive me if I make up my own mind on that one," she said, frustrated. He placed his glass down. "Be my guest." "Why are you so damn difficult? What's the problem?" Before she'd had time to react, he'd grabbed her upper arms, almost lifting her off her feet as he drew her against his chest. He'd swiftly leaned down, bringing his lips inches from hers, daring her to respond. Her natural scent engulfed his senses, and he felt a tightness girdle his chest. She didn't struggle, as her lips parted, inhaling his ragged breaths, laced with hunger. She moved forward, her mouth covering his. He began kissing her deeply. As he gently slipped his hand around her neck, cupping the back of her head, he deliberately rested his thumb on her neck, feeling her rapid pulse. If she wasn't going to talk about her physical state, he'd ascertained for himself just how sick she was. Her pulse was off the charts, and it wasn't just down to him. Pilgrim wasn't thinking. She was reacting, instinctively pressing her body into his. The heat between them was scorching what little remained of her professional resolve. Hansford bowed his head, breaking contact, lifting his lips to her brow, before gently but determinedly extricating himself. Gently tilting back her chin, he looked into her eyes, which glittered with unsated desire and a fever. "This is the problem. You and me," he said thickly. "You shouldn't be here." A discreet cough at the door caused them both to look at the waiter who'd returned with her martini. Pilgrim moved away swiftly, scooping it up and downing it in one. Placing the empty glass back on the tray, she whispered breathlessly, "I have to dress for dinner." She fled to the sanctuary of her room, knowing he was right on both counts. Together they were combustible. She couldn't think rationally around him. She'd had passionate affairs over the years, but he'd nailed her primal needs into a different league. The fact she had so little control over how she reacted to him frightened her. Maybe if he became involved with another woman, it would take the edge off. She momentarily considered the idea of another woman entering his sphere of interest. The result shocked her, as she noticed the atmosphere in her bedroom had suddenly become threateningly thick. Shaking her head in an effort to dispel any thoughts of him, she concluded she'd have to leave as soon as she could. If she had any sense of self-preservation, she'd leave Bianchi's villa right now. She picked up the parchment in its plastic sleeve and removed it. Running her fingers over the emblem, she thought of the Titan who might be behind it. Suddenly, she felt a surge of nausea and clutched at the bedspread. Baxter, that's who'd put her to rights. He must have found out something by now. She mustn't stay. She'd find out whatever there was to know and leave. She stayed in her room, eventually lying on her bed and falling into a fitful sleep. Upon waking, her head was throbbing so hard her temples ached. She took a bath and dressed for dinner. Gazing in the mirror, the face staring back was easily read. Dark circles under her eyes, skin as white as a sheet, with a fine sheen of perspiration. Her vision blurred as she grabbed out for anything to hold on to. Baxter suddenly loomed in her mind, front stage and centre, his face contorted with worry. She attempted to steady herself. With Pilgrim gone, Hansford had preoccupied his mind with the case at hand, but before long his thoughts returned to her. Finally exasperated with himself, he ran upstairs to his room to shower. Now back in the salon and dressed for dinner in a black dinner suit and tie, Hansford looked around him at the deserted room. Perhaps he had the wrong place. There were so many of them. Damn, that was it. They were all waiting in some other room for him. He breathed a mental sigh of relief as Antonio entered, smiled and asked if he'd like an aperitif. Yes, he certainly would. Whiskey, and better make it a large one. That was the room sorted out. Now to his dining companions. He wasn't quite sure what to expect from this evening's little get-together. At least he'd be able to keep an eye on Neath. He was starving, and not just for food, but that could wait. He'd declined the light afternoon repast offered by Max, and now he was kicking himself. His stomach was already growling, and he grimaced as he thought of the countless times he would have to say, "Sorry, just my stomach," as it would invariably protest. Never mind. Maybe these Italians made enough noise to drown out the sound. Antonio swept in with the whiskey and a platter, stopping in front of him. "Signor, I have put together some appetizers for you, a little something before dinner." There looked to be approximately 16, and he quickly considered how many he could decently consume before he overstepped the bounds of good manners. Sod it, he was never going to see these people again. "Thank you, Antonio. Please help yourself. I will be bringing more for the other guests." "Grazie." He tucked in with gusto. With only 4 canopies remaining amongst the crumbs, his hand hovered above them. They were some sort of crab thing, not his cup of tea at all. Better to leave them, now his appetite was temporarily sated. Hearing footsteps coming down the hall, he automatically stood to attention. Max entered, followed by a serious-looking man in red robes. He felt the temperature in the room drop. "Your Eminence, may I present Signor Hansford, a member of England's intelligence service?" Max spoke rapidly in Italian. The Cardinal nodded and took the armchair by the fire. He displayed the soft, pallid facial skin, just a little loose now for the bone underneath, indicative of a life spent within the cool, cloistered walls of ecclesiastical buildings. Sensing something of his assessment, the Cardinal looked at him with inquisitive eyes. "I am pleased to meet you, Signor Hansford. I understand you found our unfortunate daughter, Donata." "No, actually, to be precise, she was found by a person exercising their dog. Her death is a tragedy. We are all deeply saddened by this." Being mindful of his position, not quite a guest and certainly an outsider, Hansford simply agreed. The Cardinal continued quietly. "It is impossible to determine God's plan for us in such matters. We are mere instruments. Donata was a devout child. She will be in the care of our Lord now." Satisfied with his obligatory speech, he smoothed down the fabric of his cassock while straightening his sash. Hansford wondered if the cardinal knew how indifferent he sounded. Max returned with a large glass of red wine, which he offered to the cardinal. "Grazie. Eminizia," Max slipped out of the room. After taking a sip and finding it agreeable, the cardinal returned his attention to Hansford. "One may presume you are here to interview the staff and to find Donata's killer." After a couple of large swigs, Hansford was more relaxed and as prepared as he could be for this evening's social demands. "I'm here in an official capacity to offer Signor Bianchi our condolences and to answer any questions he may have concerning the safe and prompt return of his daughter's body." He took another swig. "I believe you've known Signor Bianchi for a long time." The cardinal noticed the amount of whisky Hansford was drinking, but chose to ignore it. "Signor Bianchi and his grandfather have all been good practicing Catholics and have supported their communities and its churches very well. The Bianchi family are held in high regard by all who know them. Of course, Signor Bianchi, Angelo, I have known since he was a boy." He became more contemplative. "He is alone in the world now. Such people are vulnerable, yes? I have felt a certain responsibility towards him, and of course, especially in times such as these, when our resolve to continue is tested, the Church can offer solace and guidance." "I'm sure he'll find great comfort in his faith," Hansford replied, feeling the vultures circling. The cardinal took a deep breath before continuing. "Angelo is a complicated man. His business world is seldom generous enough to allow him time for solace and to reflect. Sometimes it is hard to rekindle a belief that one has set aside. He is a good man. He does a lot of work for his people and his country. It is not work for the faint of heart, as you say. One must make difficult decisions, which ultimately affect people's lives. The balance is difficult." Hansford wondered if these platitudes were out of concern, practiced monologue, or sheer lack of imagination. It was obvious the Church had a vested interest in the Bianchi fortune. "There are plenty of high-profile business people in the world, Your Eminence, which prove their commitment to their fellow human beings every day, not by grand gestures, but by treating them in a humane and compassionate manner. Philanthropy often assuages guilt in those that can afford it." He wanted to get to exactly what the cardinal thought of Bianchi, but the cardinal didn't offer any response in word or gesture. He decided to check his dinner companion's sense of humour. "I understand the local priest will be dining with us this evening. I'm sure he's shining his shoes as we speak." The cardinal was not a novice in the subtleties of psychology and understood Hansford's interest in observing his reactions. "You must sharpen that blunt instrument of yours, otherwise I fear you will never catch Donata's killer." Hansford was warmed by the rebuke, welcoming the cardinal's directness. The cardinal continued, totally unmoved by Hansford's set expression, as he circled a ring on his little finger in detached consideration, before continuing, "I do not believe Padre Dominici will be influenced in any way by my attendance. You can count on him expressing his views of life in general and the Church. He is a godly man and an outspoken one. He will tell you himself exactly what he thinks." "You'll forgive me, Your Eminence. I didn't mean to offend you. A life spent in the military and intelligence dulls your sensitivity to social etiquette." Just then, Max opened the door, escorting Padre Dominici as he made the introductions. Signor Hansford, may I introduce Padre Dominici? Dominici stepped forward, bowing over the Cardinal's hand. He was wearing a traditional black cassock with a white split collar. He stepped forward and shook Hansford's hand. Hansford felt his rough-hewn palm and fingers, which momentarily intrigued him. Dominici addressed the Cardinal. I may have to leave a little earlier than planned. Of course, the Cardinal replied. Hansford found Dominici's relaxed countenance thought-provoking. He reminded himself of the amount he'd already imbibed and to slow things down a little. Dominici turned to Hansford, saying, I am pleased to meet you, Signor Hansford. I have heard a lot about you. He pursed his lips together in a smile. Really? Hansford was momentarily taken aback. Yes, news of your preliminary interviews today has spread through our village. All purely routine, I can assure you. Dominici accepted a glass of red wine from Max's tray, and after taking a sip continued, I am sure. All the same, it is a comfort to know the British government is looking into the death of Donata. It has upset many of the local people. By inference, I must ask, are you saying there are those people who would not be upset by Donata's death? Dominici considered the question before answering. I'm sure I don't know. May I ask why you're here this evening? Signor Bianchi insisted. He thought my presence might be conducive in promoting thought in others. We have long been friends, and I respect his methods of business and how that translates to those people in the village. Why do I feel as if all we're talking about here is money? Hansford queried. Perhaps it is because in its broader sense, that is how Signor Bianchi is perceived. Do you scorn wealthy people who help others financially? Dominici asked. I'm on the fence. Why should I waste valuable time questioning the reason behind anyone passing on their wealth? Why indeed? I sense some reticence in your answer. Why should such benevolence bother you? It is too easy perhaps to write a check. You want a person to earn or maybe suffer the right to feel good about themselves, yes? The writing of the check, perhaps it is too quick, too dismissive, yes? Something like that, if it is benevolence. It takes more than token gestures for a person to prove their sincerity and commitment, Hansford said pointedly. Ah, you prefer the blood, the sweat, the tears as evidence a person is worthy, Dominici asked, interested. I wonder how your views sit with your line of work. Max opened the door to Signor Bianchi, escorting a very sophisticated lady on his arm. Bianchi was dressed in a black classically tailored Italian suit, where the fluidity of the fabric screamed money. His companion had been poured into a black, high-neck dress. She was about 5'4" in heels and petite in every way. Her hands tiny and delicate, her feet impossibly small, and with skin the colour of cream porcelain. That of itself made her stand out, but with her midnight black hair piled in intricate ringlets on top of her head, she looked like a doll straight out of the box, with the ruby-red lips to match. She greeted the Cardinal by bestowing a kiss to the back of his hand. La vostra eminenza. Bianchi greeted the Cardinal by bestowing a kiss on both his cheeks. Just then, the door opened and Pilgrim entered, somewhat breathless and looking flushed. She wore a long black dress from her neck down to her ankles that skimmed over all the right places. Hansford's initial approval quickly gave way to concern at her pale, drawn features. She lifted a martini from Max's salver and shot an inquisitive glance at Hansford. She began apologetically, turning to the other guests. Good evening, everyone. I apologize. I do hope I've not kept you waiting. Hansford's brow furrowed. Even with makeup, she was ashen. He instinctively stepped forward, a look of anxiousness clouding his features as he took her elbow. Neath. I'm fine, she smiled tightly, lifting her elbow from his grasp. Bianchi stepped forward. There is no apology necessary. I have just arrived with Signorina Di Flavio. May I present you to our guests this evening? Bianchi smiled lightly, but there was no softness in his eyes. Cardinal Romero, Signorina Di Flavio, Padre Dominici, and of course you know Signor Hansford. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Yes, Hansford and I are old acquaintances. Her fleeting glance at him hinted to the others that perhaps their acquaintance was a cool one. Bianchi gestured towards a chair. Miss Pilgrim, won't you take a seat? Bianchi presented the picture of a financially successful man at ease in his own home. His guests, however, were more perceptive than he imagined. Signorina Di Flavio suppressed her feeling of glee. She would never honestly acknowledge she felt such an emotion. It would mean she was happy to profit from Donata's death. She'd established a good working relationship with Angelo Bianchi, but inevitably, Donata's death would push them closer together and hopefully up the aisle. As Bianchi's personal lawyer, in a position of trust like no other, she calculated she wouldn't have long to wait. She smiled sweetly at those talking to her and took in the scene, subliminally measuring their worth in words and body language. Hansford was beginning to feel like a piece on a chessboard. He reminded himself he had a job to do. He caught the eye of Neath. She was ready to drop. The intensity of his gaze made her look away. The only person he trusted in the room was her, but he admitted even she was an unknown quantity if her file was anything to go by. The information it contained had been difficult and expensive to come by, but he'd needed to fill in the gaps. The report had been frustratingly stamped, incomplete, in large red letters. He'd been able to fill in a few of the blanks himself, namely what she did for money. Her list of legal misdemeanours was short, but included multiple fines for having no car tax and a citation from some years ago for being drunk and disorderly in a public place. He chuckled at that one. The one pertinent point of interest was there was no record of her date of birth. He'd had to know more. He thought of those times when she made him feel uneasy and accepted she kept a dangerous part of herself hidden. He couldn't argue with the fact she wasn't cut from the same terrestrial cloth as everyone else. Did it bother him? No. He'd certainly not reached that conclusion overnight. It had taken the culmination of minor odd physical changes that he'd witnessed in her for him to gradually become desensitized and accepting. He pulled himself away from his thoughts. What was Bianchi hiding? He wasn't being entirely honest. And where was the damn food? A man could starve to death. His eyes fell back on Neath, watching her as she scanned the other guests. Pilgrim was unable to control her sensory intake as information flooded her consciousness. At times such as these, she quickly became alert and grasping, absorbing everything around her, colours, contrasts, smiles, the veiled expressions, the lift of a chin in answered response, but not reflected in a glance. Even her sense of smell was heightened. The musty aroma coming from the robes of Dominici mingled with a herbal soap he'd used before coming this evening. There was a sense of suppressed anger in him. The cardinal appeared emotionally distant to her. His detachment had become a habitual and occupational hazard, she conjectured. He was displaying the minimum characteristics of a man supposedly interested in others, as he employed well-practiced gestures which left his eyes vacant. She deduced he'd made a career out of the church. It had not been his calling. She turned her subtle but penetrating analysis to Signorina de Flavio. Fine-boned and underweight. Did she know she worked too hard? Of course she did. She was driven. Her clothes were haute couture, but she took no pleasure in them. They fulfilled a function, giving the appearance of wealth and success, crucial and demanded at her level in Italian society. She was also a passionate woman. Oh, she hid it well, but it was all there, in the way she touched her neck when she was listening to Bianchi. A life lived in duality, that degree of effort to suppress one's true nature was all-consuming to sustain. It meant sacrifice. It meant extraordinary discipline. It meant tears and the spiritual contortion of oneself. That type of discipline was self-absorbing. You became fixated on such routine. She should know. Then there was Bianchi, a man so bereft he was unable to vent his grief on any level. She was almost fooled into thinking he was unmoved by Donata's death, until she caught him smile weakly at Max. As she looked up, she caught Hansford watching her. She recognized his expression as one of anxious curiosity. She looked away, her mind set on taking in everything and assimilating it later, just before she'd sleep. Bianchi addressed them. "I would like to thank you all for coming here. This is indeed a sad time, not only for me, but for those here who were part of Donata's life. You will forgive me, but I did not select my dinner guest this evening for a social occasion. You're here because I believe you can help me to discover the person responsible for murdering my daughter. I will be leaving you shortly, and we will meet with some of you at breakfast tomorrow." As the Cardinal began to speak, Bianchi raised his hand to silence him. "Donata will be better served if I do not feature in this evening's equation as a distraction to your conversation. You are, after all, the people most closely associated with her case and with the history of my daughter. I would like to wish you all a productive evening." The Cardinal, obviously feeling put out, began, "Angelo, I am here as an advisor in matters of spirituality and as a friend. I fail to see how I can contribute." Bianchi leaned forward, whispering in the Cardinal's ear. Only Pilgrim and Hansford noted the ashen pallor diffusing the Cardinal's face. Bianchi straightened up, smiled, and left. The room fell silent after his departure, as each one looked at the other for a reaction. Suddenly, Hansford clapped his hands together, declaring, "I'm starving. I hope dinner's on its way." The other guests stared at him in surprise. "What? Don't tell me you're not hungry. Bloody hell, I know I am," he stated, taking a deep inhalation and patting his stomach affectionately. He noted Neath was smiling at him. He grinned back at her. Max entered the room. "Dinner is now served, if you would follow me." Dinner was a hollow, dry affair. Delicious dishes made tasteless by redundant palates. Nobody wanted to be there, let alone surrounded by strangers. Signorina de Flavio, having finished, arranged her cutlery before addressing Pilgrim. "You will forgive me, Signor Pilgrim. I am intrigued as to your presence here. I am not fully briefed, other than knowing your name, and that you are a friend of Angelo's." Placing her fork and spoon precisely together on her plate, Pilgrim answered gently, "I'm here to lend my insight and observe." There was a silence, prompting Pilgrim to raise her gaze from her plate to the expectant faces of the other guests. before Signorina de Flavio queried again, "Observe?" Hansford's mood had changed to one of affability, as looking at her in quizzical amusement, he asked, "I was wondering about that. What kind of insight are we talking about?" The black coldness in her eyes made him mentally step back. He recognized danger when it was present. A voice inside him told him to shut up and leave it, but her influence on him was too acute. Any effort by him not to engage her evaporated. Pilgrim could taste the need in Hansford from across the table. She willed herself to ignore it. "I'm a little more perceptive than most, intuitive. It might be helpful." Dominici looked intrigued. "That is interesting. So you must have extraordinary skills." The table fell quiet. No one lifted a glass to their lips as they waited for her to explain. She inhaled lightly. "Yes." Signorina de Flavio said, "You have the confidence of Angelo. That is enough for me. You should come and work for me. I could do with someone like you in my office." She laughed brittly. "My skills are purely of an instinctual nature," Pilgrim prompted to keep her on track. Hansford felt compelled to verbally step in. Damn it, why did he feel he had to defend her? Just as he was about to say something, Dominici piped up. "I'm a believer. I understand how hard it can be to educate a person who has no experience of a faith to believe in something intangible. It makes perfect sense to me." Signorina de Flavio arched an inquisitive eyebrow. She turned her perfectly coiffed head, saying sweetly, "I hope you will forgive me, but I understood our purpose here is to put on the table the evidence we have to date concerning the death of Donata." Hansford spoke up, his patience wearing thin. "It is. So what would you like us to know that's pertinent?" Signorina de Flavio's red pout, as she surveyed the others around the table, gave the impression she believed she felt above such things. That is, until her gaze fell upon Pilgrim. Her look of barely concealed annoyance prompted her to continue. "Without divulging any confidences, I can offer you information that is in the public domain." "Oh, that's going to be useful. Things we already know," Hansford muttered. Pilgrim addressed Signorina de Flavio. "Is there something here we're missing?" Signorina de Flavio smiled. "There may be, let us say, some things within the public domain may be disguised as something else. Who is to say what is important and what is not? For example, did you know the email luring Donata from the house originated from Beaune in France?" Hansford held his fork in midway between his plate and mouth before placing it down and asking, "Do you have concrete evidence proving that?" "Yes, I do." Hansford clenched his hands over his salmon tureen before asking Max, "Take this away and bring me a large bowl of soup, please." "Certainly, senor." Hansford had the look of the hunter about him, his shoulders hunched forward, his whole focus now on Signorina de Flavio. "Continue," he instructed her. She took a deep breath and began. "Signor Bianchi, in his time and in the time of his father and grandfather, has been the focus of public scrutiny. With this comes the inevitable planning for gain by others, either by exploitation, bribery, or ransom. Almost 2 years ago, Signor Bianchi attended a meeting of the Vigneron de Bourgogne. Recently, at the Hospice de Beaune, millions of euros change hands for the liquid door of Napoleon Bonaparte." Pilgrim's sudden intake of breath was not lost on Hansford, who impatiently interjected, "I'm sorry, you're going to have to translate that one for me on account of my not knowing what the hell you're talking about. Neath, you know something about this, don't you?" She picked up her glass and took a sip before confirming. Yes, as recently as 48 hours ago. Why didn't you say something? Because I had no idea of its relevance, she lied. Signorina de Flavio added, Perhaps if you would not mind, there is another here who has an in-depth knowledge of this. She stared at the cardinal, defying him to deny it. His look of reluctance to discuss the matter spoke volumes. Clearing his throat, he answered, You are right, Signorina. I, along with many others, have heard of the champagne cognac known as the liquid gold of Napoleon. Lifting his glass, he downed the remaining contents, adding gruffly, Who do I have to ordain to get a drink around here? It was clear he was being forced to act against his will, and his annoyance was evident. He stopped midstream and toyed with the salmon terrine on his plate. Pilgrim was all ears, realizing here was a possible connection. Speaking up, she inquired of Signorina de Flavio, Perhaps you would care to enlighten those of us unfamiliar with this liquid door about what possible link it might have to Donata's death. Motive? Hansford suggested. It's possible, Pilgrim conceded. Signorina de Flavio continued slowly, pondering the question in the process. Someone was willing to pay millions for one barrel, and if we are to believe it has resurfaced after all this time, I don't think it can be a coincidence, given Angelo's connection. What's Bianchi got to do with all this? It has been an ongoing obsession of his since he heard about the story as a boy. Hansford was familiar with people coveting money, but cognac? You'll forgive me, Signorina, but I don't understand the reason we're discussing some old brandy which may not even exist. It is simply there is no murder without motive, and the liquid door could be just that. Pilgrim was paying close attention to her fellow guests. The cardinal seemed particularly aggrieved at being included in the conversation. If the whole cash were recovered, it would be worth millions of your British pounds, Signorina de Flavio pointed out. I see. So this is a motive for only the well-heeled, Hansford remarked. Pardon me, I do not understand, she questioned, confused. What I mean to say is, this is a motive that is reserved for a very small percentage of the population, he clarified. The cardinal spoke up. He was finished with his terrine and was dabbing the corners of his mouth, a look of grim determination on his face. I can tell you the story of the liquid d'or de Napoleon is nothing more than that, a story. The person who brought the cask in Bourne will be bitterly disappointed. It cannot be the real liquid d'or. Many rational men have sunk their fortune into trying to find it. The important fact of this story is that its existence has never been substantiated. He raised an eyebrow as if to make his point. It seems to me, if there were any truth to it, someone would have found it out by now, especially considering there must have been those people in history who have applied considerable pressure and resources towards its recovery. There's more than one? Hansford questioned. 6, to be precise, Dominici answered. That's a lot of money. Who was the seller? Hansford asked. Christie's confidential records drew a blank, Pilgrim answered. You were there? He asked incredulously. Yes, with Baxter. You didn't buy it, did you? No, it was bought by a man called Mr. Phelps on behalf of an interested party. Hansford's eyes glittered menacingly at her before saying, I don't like the maths on this one. Then keep it to yourself. Instinct and perception, my arse. They paused, looking around the table at the expectant faces. Just a little in-joke, he explained. Pilgrim noticed Dominici looked pale, and a fine sheen of perspiration was evident on his upper lip. He had the look of a person who believed they were in imminent danger. She observed the other guests. They appeared unaware of his discomfort. She addressed Hansford. "So, now you're up to speed. Any thoughts?" Knowing Neath suspected the Titans were behind this whole debacle, and that her last run-in with them had proved catastrophic, looking at her, he said evenly, "I'll deal with you later." She gave a dismissive huff, whilst the other guests now deduced there was actually more to their relationship than they'd first imagined. Turning to the rest of the guests, Hansford said politely, "Now, where were we? Ah, yes. Your Eminence was trying to convince us the liquid door doesn't exist. Signorina de Flavio believes there is a distinct possibility it does. And Padre Dominici, well..." He eyed Dominici carefully and continued in his appraisal. "He's certain it exists." Dominici turned to Hansford, obviously annoyed by his statement. "I do not believe in the French gold. Why should I? I have heard about the story. Anyone connected to this town has heard about it, but that does not make me believe it." Hansford quickly interjected, "And why would anyone connected with this town have heard of it?" "There was a story it was brought here when Italy formed part of France. Nothing has ever been found." "Anyone with a trained eye can see you became uncomfortable when it was mentioned. Why would that be?" He leaned forward on his elbow. "My guess is you have some knowledge of it. I don't believe you know where it is, but you know something new, perhaps." Dominici shot an involuntary glance over to the Cardinal, quickly looking back at his dinner plate. Pilgrim jumped in before Hansford could continue. "Signorina, we know if the remainder of the liquid door was found, then the finder would be very rich. Can anyone lay claim to it?" Signorina de Flavio placed her right forearm on the table and slowly turned the stem of her wine-glass. She spoke softly, but with conviction. "Assuming the story is true, and the liquid door is drinkable..." She paused for a moment as the others fell silent. "The value of just one cask could be conjectured, notwithstanding the ridiculous price that one went for in Bourne, of in excess of £30 million sterling. The interest from Japan alone would push it far beyond that, I think. The country it is found in can legally lay claim to it. How much for would be settled by attorneys. My professional theory on the matter is it does not fit the parameters of what can be defined as a national treasure or something of historical importance. Therefore, as you say, all bets are off." "Could it all be here in Goetta somewhere?" Dominici spoke up. "As we're sitting in what used to belong to the French Empire, it's feasible, but extremely unlikely." Signorina de Flavio added, "You can understand the legal ramifications if it were found." Pilgrim was absorbing her words. The Cardinal seemed oblivious to the heated atmosphere and had already begun his main course. Dominici was looking down, quietly pushing his food around his plate. Hansford spoke up. "Interesting. What do you think, Neath?" He caught her off guard. She'd been taking in the atmosphere around the table and felt almost out of breath. Turning towards him, she spoke seriously in her assessment, addressing everyone around the table. "I believe I'm beginning to understand the full extent of why we were put together. I'm going to speak frankly, knowing what I have to say has an element of truth. I am compelled to believe the remaining barrels of liquid door exist. There is now a connection between proof of its existence and the death of Donata Bianchi." She stopped and took a sip of her wine. The quiet in the room was unnerving. Looking directly at Pilgrim, the Cardinal said softly, "I do not agree. You want us to believe such a fantastic story without a piece of real evidence." He was looking around the table for the support of his fellow diners. They in turn looked back expectantly to her. She looked concerned but confident as she replied, "You're mistaken. I do have evidence to prove the liquid door de Napoleon exists." The table came alive. The Cardinal's face became ashen. There was an incredulous look from Signorina de Flavio, wide-eyed amazement from Dominici, and a look of anger from Hansford. She ignored them all and began to relate her visit to the auction. Her being handed a brass rubbing on parchment that she'd initially and mistakenly assumed had come from the auctioned barrel. The liquid door at the auction was barrel number 6, clearly stamped in Roman numerals on both the cask and the gold seal. Pilgrim opened her purse and removed the plastic pocket containing the brass rubbing. "You can clearly see this parchment rubbing has been taken from another barrel, number 4. They each passed it around the table, scrutinizing it. "I've sent a copy to the Antiquities Department at the Louvre. Naturally, they have a specialist in Napoleonic ephemera." Pilgrim spoke slowly, dabbing the corners of her mouth and giving Hansford an icy stare. Signorina de Flavio replied, her face flushed with excitement. "But this is incredible. When will you hear?" "Soon." "I'd better be included in that," Hansford ground out. "Of course you will," she replied quietly. "You've neglected to tell us the location of the remaining barrels?" Dominici asked anxiously. "I didn't neglect to tell you. I don't know." Dominici spoke up. The colour had returned to his cheeks, and he seemed more settled. He leaned to his left, and speaking behind his hand, whispered something to the Cardinal, who nodded as Dominici rose from the table. "I would like to thank you all for making this evening a memorable one. It has been a pleasure to meet with you all." He smiled at Pilgrim and Hansford. "I am happy to cooperate with your investigation. You know where to find me. Now, if you will excuse me, I have 1 or 2 matters which require my personal attention." With that, he gave a small bow and, turning, left the room. Hansford was surprised by his sudden departure and was just about to voice his thoughts on the matter when the Cardinal interjected. "Please avoid reading more into Padre Dominici's departure than there is. We were lucky to see him this evening. One of his parishioners is gravely ill. It is necessary he attends to them." Smiling, he turned his attention to Signorina de Flavio. "Now, I would like to ask you, Signorina de Flavio, if Donata had made a will." "As it forms part of a written statement which will be published in Monday's obituary column, I see no reason not to tell you. Yes, she left a will, which was drawn up after her 16th birthday by our offices. I myself officiated at its signing. The will is simple and straightforward. She left all her belongings to her next of kin, in this case her father. There was a codicil made last summer. It concerns the house which Donata inherited from her mother. Donata's will leaves the house to the church." Hansford was troubled. "I agree it's normal for an older person, or even someone who's sick, to make a will, even to leave something to the church. But a young, healthy girl of 16? That doesn't make sense. Were there any specifics in the codicil? Anything at all?" Signorina de Flavio shook her head. "Nothing. The only request, which seemed in keeping with the sentiment of the will, was to have it read in the crypt of the church." Pilgrim spoke up, inquiring, Is that allowed? I mean, a civil ceremony on church grounds? The cardinal answered, You are right. It is not normal procedure, but I believe we will make an exception in this case. There is no question of not accommodating Donata's last wishes. Max and Antonio had returned to clear the dinner plates. Pilgrim pushed hers away, asking to be excused for the evening. She looked pale and shattered. I hope you'll forgive me, but I am going to retire for the night. It's been enlightening. She deliberately avoided looking at Hansford. He immediately stood with a genuine look of concern on his face. I'll walk you to your room. You look like you're ready to drop. He took her arm and entwined it around his and began to excuse himself to the two remaining guests. She laughed lightly, withdrawing her arm from his. Thank you, but I think I can navigate one flight of stairs and a short corridor. Seeing the grave look on his face, she added reassuringly, I'm just tired, not at death's door. I'll be asleep before you know it. With that final remark, she smiled at the cardinal and Signorina de Flavio and left. At the bottom of the stairs, a wave of nausea hit her, and she grabbed hold of the handrail to steady herself. Pulling her aching body up the stairs, she puzzled at the bruising that was beginning to show on the back of her hands. Suddenly, a violent pain seared through her body, causing her to black out. Hansford was right behind her, catching her as she fell. Shouting for Max, he carried her in his arms to her room. Placing her gently on the bed, he felt her temperature. She was stone cold and covered in perspiration. Hearing Max behind him, he ordered, Fetch a doctor immediately. Pilgrim was having a nightmare. She was back downstairs with the guests sitting at the table, waiting for the main course to be served. They appeared as they had been that evening, except for their facial features, which were strangely distorted. As they continued to talk amongst themselves, they passed an occasional glance over at her. The cardinal's nose had become elongated and hooked. Signorina de Flavio was wearing a very thick pair of glasses, making her eyes look enormous. Padre Dominici did not have a mouth, and Hansford's disproportionate hands were flailing about. She awoke some time after with a start, to find herself standing in the dark by her balcony window in only her nightdress, which was now stuck to her body with sweat. The floor was cool under her feet. Her head was pounding. As she began to sway, she reached out for the curtain to steady herself. Stepping back, she let out a muffled scream as a man's hand descended across her mouth to silence her. Opening her mouth a fraction, she bit down hard, her eyes immediately flashing neon blue to black. "It's me, you idiot!" Hansford hissed through gritted teeth, turning her around to face him. Upon seeing the blackness of her eyes, he realized he was in danger. "You think that'll protect you?" she whispered ominously. "Neath, you're sick. The doctor was here. He thinks it's some kind of food poisoning." He saw the irrational fever in her eyes. She shook her head, smiling. "You're here of your own volition. I can't be held responsible for that." Her predatory steps towards him caused him to slowly back away from her towards the bedroom door. "Neath, you fainted at the bottom of the stairs. Now, let's not do anything stupid." She froze momentarily, her eyes turning the colour of black sapphire. She stepped away from him, confused and delirious, attempting to gain some control, but was unable to. "You know, you really ought to take more care," she warned. "Neath, you're not yourself." "Not myself. I'm entirely myself, more than you know." He could clearly see the being she kept at bay beginning to surface. "Neath, you need to calm down. I'm going to leave. You should go back to bed. He felt behind him for the door handle. She was saturated in perspiration, her hair stuck to her face and clearly burning up from a fever. I dare you to run, she whispered, before suddenly collapsing against the wall. He leapt forward, catching her. As her eyes fluttered open, she gasped, "Baxter, get Baxter," before passing out. He felt his heart ripped from his chest. Lifting her onto the bed, he turned on the bedside lamp and took her pulse, which had become dangerously slow. He quickly assessed the condition of her skin, which was deteriorating rapidly, showing heightened areas of dark bruising. Her erratic breathing caused him to recognize that she was near death. He leapt into action. She was way beyond the help of the local GP. He didn't care who she wanted. He'd get them for her. Pulling out his phone, he called Lamethyst as he rifled through her personal belongings, searching for clues to her dire condition. On his knees by her bed, waiting for Baxter to pick up, he saw the parchment of the emblem. Reaching forward to retrieve it, his hand froze. Using a corner of the bed covers, he picked it up and dropped it back into the plastic pocket. It was taking too long for Baxter to pick up. Suddenly, he heard Baxter's voice say seriously, "Hansford, it's Baxter. You don't need to tell me. I'm already on my way."